we have an interesting situation in First Timothy chapter 5 because we get some rare insight into something that happened in the book of Acts, a little more detail. We see in Acts chapter 2 and several other passages where they are, it's obvious that they're acting in a way of supporting each other. We have to learn, but we're learning some guidelines and things here in this chapter, in this book, that can kind of help us see what was going on perhaps in the first century. Now, different circumstances, different places. I recognize this is Ephesus, and what was happening in Acts chapter 2 is going to be actually the church in Jerusalem. But there's similarities in the sense that they're still being supportive. They're supporting people. We can see this also in Acts chapter 6, where they ran into one of their first major problems. That is, they were giving food out to widows, and there were some who felt like they were being neglected, and so they had to get together and deal with it in the best way possible. If you read through those passages, it almost seems like, or at least some people have interpreted it, and please understand when I say this, I'm not wanting to get into politics, but it's almost interpreted as people. The church in the first century was a communist regime where everyone gave up everything that they had, and then the disciples or the apostles doled out to each person or each family whatever they were going to get. And so I've actually heard people trying to support the idea of communism or similar things in that. Now, like I said, I'm not about talking about politics, but that is a misunderstanding of what they did. They didn't give up their own ability to take care of themselves. They gave up their own ability to pay their own bills and have the church to support everything. Although some people, like I said, some people would prefer that. But so in talking about this in 1 Timothy 5, we can see a glimpse into the other side of this. In Acts, it seems like, well, everybody just gave everything and everyone was sharing everything. And actually what we're seeing in 1 Timothy 5 is the church didn't function like that. If it did at first, this was a special circumstance that Paul told Timothy that wasn't the way it was going to happen. And so we're going to talk about balancing the burdens on the church, and that's where this passage is really about. And really, the whole section here is treating other people with dignity deserving of family. Look at what he says in chapter 5 and verse 1. Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, with all purity. And then he goes into another section, still dealing with how to treat people. In fact, the heading in my section in verse 3, it says, honor true widows. So we're still talking about showing honor, and we'll even go into the next section in verse 17, which we're not getting into tonight. We're honoring elders. And so this has to do, the word honor here implies a little more than simply giving someone credit or simply honoring them or like showing respect. This is also showing respect in the sense these are people who are being supported by the church. And so it's important that we understand what's going on. And Paul, of course, is writing to Timothy in chapter 3 and verse 15. He's writing so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. He's getting at here are the practical things that a congregation work. And in order to have us function in the best way possible, we have to be treating each other with respect and treating each other like family, but there are parameters and principles that we have to consider for that to actually work in the best way. And so he's going to give here examples of that. The example we're going to see next week, Lord willing, is the example of how we honor elders. And this week, we're looking at the example of related to widows. Now, I'm pulling this out because it's obviously because it's in the text, but also because this is an example that gives us principles to consider that applies to a whole lot more than widows. It applies to all of us to a certain degree, and we have to discern how it applies and that kind of thing. So as we walk through that, remember that this is not just about widows. This is about principles that can be used to apply to any of us. And we all, to some degree, are going to make some decisions based on that. So let's think about the principles that are taught through this teaching about widows. First of all, we have the principle of determining the need, right? So look at what he's saying here in verse 3. Honor widows who are really widows, right? We're determining the need. And he goes into a little detail about how do you determine whether or not someone's actually a widow that the church should be supporting. And look at what he says here. He gives a list of things. He says, this is one. Look at, if any widow in verse 4, if anyone a widow has children or grandchildren, let those children or grandchildren first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now, she who is really a widow and left alone, you see, we have that idea of alone, trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. So it shows that she's a spiritual person, that she is trusting in God and showing that trust by going to God, and she's a prayerful person. We also see one who is over 60, because it says, but she, in verse 6, she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. These things command and teach, or these things command that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, especially those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever, which we're going to come back to this. But verse 9 says, do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number. Okay? So this is a stipulation that he set up. He also said then that this is a one-man woman is actually how it's reported. It's the same structure as we have for the regulations for elders, that they be a one-woman man. It's the same structure, except it's the women and men are reversed. So this is a person who is someone who is the wife. It says at the end of verse 9, not unless she has been the wife of one man. Okay, and that she's also, in verse 10, well reported for good work. So there are stipulations involved in saying, okay, who is the church going to support? And this would be matters of priority, right? And we'll talk about that too. It doesn't mean that no one else, but it does mean that there had to be priorities, and there's reasons for that. We'll talk about that here as we go. But look at what it says, well reported of for good works. If she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. All right, these are the stipulations. But look at what he says in verse 11. What about those women who were widows who were under 60 years old? He says, refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow once and against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they've cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering from house to house, not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they are not. Therefore, I desire that the younger women marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are widows. Now, I want to throw some defense out here for Paul. We have to keep things in context, culturally and socially, and even in the context of the Scripture. He is not, I believe he is suggesting that any woman over 60 is automatically going to go out and be a busybody and a gossip. But the tendency is going to be greater for them than it would be for someone who is over 60, both in maturity level, although I've seen people over 60 act very immature. I mean, we all know that happens. But the maturity level tends to be there for over 60, and plus they can't, okay, take this in the way that it's meant. People over 60 generally don't get around as well as people under 60, right? So they're not going to be usually going from house to house causing problems. And there are some questions about this text that we don't know. There's some things here. It seems like that there was an order, so to speak. There was almost like a classification of widow that the church supported. And it's almost as if they quote unquote hired these ladies to pray for the church, to give them support. Now, there are some people who believe that that's what we're reading about. And part of that is it would have been that they would have been women who dedicated themselves to the Lord and to the work of the Lord, and said that they would never marry again. It's a possibility because of the way he phrases some things in here. And in fact, if you look at what he says, don't let a widow under 60 be taken into the number. What is the number? It's the number of the widows, right? So it's a group. It's an assigned group, just like we would have elders or deacons, except in a different sense, right? So this is a woman who's refused the woman who's younger, because look at verse 12. At the end of verse 10, it says they desire to marry, right? refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry. Why is it wrong to marry someone? It wouldn't be wrong, but he's saying the chances of a lady under a widow under 60 years old desiring to marry again is higher than one who is over 60. Now, in our culture, it may be a little bit different, but what we're dealing with here is priorities that he's setting up. And he says that they've gone wanton against Christ, they desire to marry. There's some people then that believe, and I tend to think that this way, that these were talking about women who are over 60. These are women who are widows who have dedicated and devoted themselves to prayer and in service to the church like that. And as a result, they're being supported by the church, and they've committed to not marrying again. But those who are under 60, they're more likely to marry, and if they do, and they make this vow, this commitment to not marry again, instead they're going to support the church. They have a tendency to want to be married again anyway. That's a possibility of what's happening. That's the most reasonable idea that's presented from what I can see. And you might can talk to me. You may have other ideas about what's going on. But there is definitely a contrast going on. Whatever is going on, there's definitely a contrast between the older widows and the younger widows. There's also a contrast between the widows who are actually, even the older ones, who are going to be the ones that are going to be supported versus the ones who are not going to be supported. The ones who are going to be supported are the ones who actually are alone. They don't have any children or grandchildren that can support them. They trust in God, or they're devoted to God in prayer. They're over 60. They're a one-man woman. That is, that they've only been married to one man, and they are known for good works. What about the widows? Somebody asked me this question. What about the widows who are over 60 who didn't do good works? Were they unworthy of being supported? And I would suggest that they have to have priorities, right? So here is an indication that Paul is saying there are times when you have to say no to helping someone. That kind of goes against the grain of what we think, isn't it? It kind of goes against the grain of what we're supposed to help everyone. Yes, that's true, generally speaking, but we have to make decisions sometimes. How do you decide who you're going to help if you have 2 or 3 different people and you can only help one? You've got to make some kind of judgments, and he's given us the criteria by which to make those judgments. It goes back to what we talked about in James and several other places about James chapter 2, about making the distinction between the rich and the poor, and telling the rich man, you sit here in a good seat, and telling the poor man, you can sit here at my feet. See, what he was talking about in that section was all about the decisions that we make and the criteria we use to make those decisions. That kind of criteria is wrong. You don't make criteria. You don't judge someone based upon how much money they have. You have other ways of judging them, right? The other ways of judging them would be, are they faithful to God? That would be part of the consideration. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, which we're going to talk about. So here it's interesting when we see this. First of all, we've got to determine the need. And someone then who has family, who has children or grandchildren, a lady, an elderly lady who is a widow, which was more common than a widower. Back then, not as much now, even though it is possible. Back then, this woman was destitute. There was very little she could do to take care of herself. And so she needed help. And Paul's words were, don't just give money to everyone who is a widow. If they have children or grandchildren, let them take care of them. He's qualifying this, right? And it's not because he's being mean. It's because, why? Because there are people who have legitimate need who you may miss because you're giving the money away to people who may not really need it after all. And it also encourages, of course, that family to step up and take control and actually repay what he says. You remember what he said that? He said to let them repay those their parents, right? Or their grandparents. So this is the idea he wanted them to understand. And look in verse 16. If any man, a believing man or woman, has widows, let them relieve them, and not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. So we're balancing things out. We're balancing priorities. And that's really what we're doing. So that's the first principle, is determining the need. And then we have to balance the need. Look in Galatians chapter 6 and verses 2 and 5. Here's a principle. We're going to look at 3 principles related to how to balance the need and determine then, based on the need, there's a lot of judgments that have to be made here. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2 says to bear one another's burden and so fulfill the law of Christ. So we have to bear one another's burdens. That's expected for us if we want to fulfill the law of Christ. But then if you look in verse 5, it says, for each one shall bear his own load. Now this is contextually in relationship to people in verse 1 who have a man who is overtaken in any trespass. It says you are to go help that person, right? We bear their burden, but everyone's responsible for themselves ultimately. This does relate to people who have been caught up in sin. There's no question about that. But the principle says that we have to take care of ourselves. And the Bible is very clear about that. In fact, it says that if a man shall not work, neither shall he eat, right? So there are many, many passages that deal with that principle. So we have to balance that. We have a willingness to help people, but if people are not willing to help themselves, then we have to take that into consideration as well. That's part of balancing the need. And so if you look in 1 Timothy chapter 5, back in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 14, that's what we're reading there. It says, I desire that the younger women marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. Here is a way that a woman back then who was a widow could help take care of herself and not burden the church. She would go and simply remarry. Oh, it's not quite as simple as saying, hey, I want to get married again, right? I know there's some work involved in there, and maybe there's some help that would need to be supplied to her, especially if she was alone. But the ideal is to get her into another marriage. And, of course, the stipulation for that is that she would marry only in the Lord. But this is how he's balancing the need. Look in chapter 5 and verse 4. It says, if anyone widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. And also in verse 8, if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That tells me that it is our obligation as Christians to support our parents and our grandparents and family members as best that we can. And obviously, it says, if we look at and we take it seriously, what he says, anyone who does not provide for his own house, especially his own, and especially those of his own household, he's denied the faith. And so what he's saying here is instead of saying, well, listen, I'm going to let the church take care of mom. I've got extra money that way. Instead of doing that, he says that's worse than an infidel. So we have to make decisions sometimes that are difficult for us to make. And we have to keep priority in mind. And Paul is saying that the important thing we need to make sure we do is not ignore our family, but to help our family. We can ignore our family by pursuing other things that we want to use our money for instead of making sacrifice to help our parents or grandparents who are in need. In fact, our chances are pretty high that your parents or grandparents made sacrifices for you to support you while you were being raised. It is only fitting that we would also make sacrifices for them in their old age to help them as we should. And so this is a very important topic. And if you notice what he's saying here in principle then is we're going from smaller to larger units. It's perfectly fine for the church to help anyone in need, but what God intends to happen is smaller units, the small family units, are going to take care of their own as best that they can. And if they can't be taken care of, then they might could take it to the church, or maybe extended family and then the church. It would depend on how you wanted to look at it. So we have the smaller to the greater. In fact, this principle was very well used in the Bible. Think about remember when Jethro came up to Moses and said, "You're working yourself too hard. You're sitting in judgment all day long. Everyone has a problem. They come to you and you make judgments." He said, you need to divide this workload up, right? So you have people over tens and people over 50s and people over hundreds. And if they run into one and they can't make a judgment, they go to the next one up. And so there's a hierarchy that's set up. That's biblical, and it is biblical in the church as well. Every time we need something, if we think, okay, well, my first response is to go to the church for help. Sure, the church wants to help, but the first response is I need to go to my family because that's why they're there. And if you don't have family that can take care of you, or you have family that won't take care of you, then you move on up the chain. And I think we all understand that. But sometimes we're on the other side of that, and we're looking and trying to make decisions about how we're going to help people and who we should help. Sometimes we kind of miss that. We really want to be generous with the Lord's money sometimes when maybe we shouldn't be. And like I said, that's a matter of judgment in each case. But it should be a judgment that we make, right? And we should have these kinds of discussions about what's going on. So we balance the need. Also, another principle that we're going to look at here is Ephesians chapter 6, verses 2 and 3. That really is kind of already been stated. In Ephesians chapter 6, 2 and 3 is the promise that was made of blessing. It says, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. Honor your father and mother. Honoring your father and mother means that you're going to obey them, especially if you're a child. It also means that you're going to help them and support them. It means that you're going to take care of them. And as Christians, that's what we should be looking to do. And they deserve that much. And that's the way God intended for it to be for us. So we also then, in balancing the need, we have this third idea, and that is prioritizing the work, prioritizing the finances. And we talk about this quite a bit. In fact, we just got through talking about a budget over here with the men. And so my intention is not to discourage people from asking for help. That's not my intention at all. If you need help from the church, please ask. It's our obligation and our blessing to be able to help other people, certainly. But we also need to think about the fact that there are proper channels that we go through. And the first recourse is to go to family. Now, like I said, sometimes family can't help, but that's where we start. And they're a whole lot more likely to help than a bunch of people that don't understand the situation, right? And if they won't help, it might be an indication that maybe you need to take care of yourself. I guess maybe we should look at ourselves first, right? And then we go to family. But sometimes and I think is a good point. I shouldn't leave that out, because sometimes we want to have help, and what we need for help is to get out and put some elbow grease in, right? We need to get out and get to work. And I've run into people that over my lifetime who needed money for food and were perfectly capable of having a job, but wouldn't even try to find one. And it's almost like some of them that I've met is like, I'm too good to work at this place. That's taking a step down for me. And I can understand how that might affect your career if you're in this area and then you step down and take a job at McDonald's. I can understand how that would be taking a step backwards, but at the same time, it's kind of taking a step forward from where you actually are in life, right? So you go from not being able to eat to being able to eat. That's a pretty good step in the right direction. So I know some of the arguments that are made with that, and I'm not trying to make all the judgments here, but it is interesting how sometimes we get so caught up in things that we don't really think about the fact that we have an obligation, not just an opportunity, not just a freedom, an obligation to take care of ourselves, and an obligation to take care of family, and for our family to take care of us. We are here for each other. And then, of course, we have the idea of Corban. Look in Mark chapter 7 and verse 11. So what I don't want to do is come across in such a way that it sounds like I'm participating in Corban. Mark chapter 7 and verse 10. Moses said, honor your father and mother, and he who curses father and mother, let him be put to death. This is verse 10. But you say, if a man says his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is Corban, that is a gift of God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother. Now, the Jewish people had a way around the scriptures. So the scriptures indicated that they're supposed to support their parents. That's what it's always been. But they came up with a clever scheme called Corban. And that is, if you made a vow to give your money to the temple, then you actually didn't have to help your parents because that money was vowed to the temple. So you can't take care of them anymore. And some people would do that in order to get around having to help their parents, but more than likely it was set up by the temple, by the leaders, to find ways to get more money into the coffers. It's Corban. So I don't want to in any way come across like this is okay. And so in saying this, I'm not trying to discourage people from asking for help. If you need help, please ask for it. And the church, I know, is very willing to help. But we also need to remember that God did set up channels for a reason, and that's why we have to balance things. So let's put it all together. How do we know? And this is really in principle here. This is what he's talking about back in 1 Timothy chapter 5. In principle, what he's talking about here is how do we know whether or not a widow is actually in need? And we can surmise from that how we could apply this to other people. First of all, it's someone in need who is faithful. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, it says, "Let us do good to all men, especially to those of the household of faith." So what that tells me, and the word especially is especially, right? What that tells me is that if you have two people who are asking for help, and one is a faithful Christian and the other one is not, you're supposed to help the faithful Christian. We often don't think that way. We often think, here's a great evangelistic opportunity. If we help this other person, they might come to the Lord. There's no guarantee of that, first of all. But secondly, God has shown us what the priority is. We are to help our own. The priority is to help everyone, especially those who are the household of faith. And that principle is shown in this chapter, 1 Timothy chapter 5. So if someone is faithful, then also unable to care for themselves. There are legitimate needs. People can't take care of themselves. It could be that they can't work. It could be that they can't find employment. It could be that they're, because of their age, they're not able to function and work a difficult job that they might have. We have to be sympathetic with that. We have to understand that, right? We're also not taking from others' responsibilities. Anytime that we step into a situation and act in a way that would prohibit other people from fulfilling their obligations, their duties, we're not helping anyone, we're hurting them. So that's the reason we have to go through the proper channels. As a church, we can't just step in and say, this has to be done now, and so we're going to jump in. Now, in emergencies, that's a little bit different. But if someone has need and we don't even consider whether or not their children can help them, what we're doing is saying the church is going to take care of this for you. You don't have to worry about, the children don't have to worry about fulfilling their obligation. How can they fulfill their obligation, their responsibility to their parents, if we do it for them without even talking to them about it? See, that's why we have to look at the priorities. That's some of the decisions that have to be made. Now, this is very practical stuff. I realize that. Sometimes we're looking at the church and we don't consider how we use our funds. And especially if you're not in a men's meeting, you don't really see how the funds are being used at all. You don't hear some of the discussion. And some of you ladies, I know I can empathize that you may have no idea what's going on. You may have no idea why people make decisions that are being made. You may not even know why the money is used in the way that it is. But there are principles that guide us that have to be considered, and these are some of them. And sometimes we need to just be reminded of it. And that's why Paul was sending this to Timothy. And it also, here's another interesting point. It seemed like they were expected to work. And what I mean by that was that if they were a class of the church where they were being supported and they were dedicated themselves to the work of the church in prayer, that's what this is about. Like I said, I don't know for a fact that that's what happened, but it seems like that's what happened. And we can make a pretty good case for that. So the people that they supported would have been women who were widows, who were over 60, who couldn't support themselves, who had dedicated themselves to prayer for the church. And the church says, here, we'll help you with this. We'll help you do this. These are the ideal candidates for who we should help. Isn't it interesting? That in principle or in application, it's possible that a Christian would look at widows and say, I'm sorry, but we can't help you. Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this, that you visit the widow and the orphan in their trouble, right? And you keep yourself unspotted from the world. That's balanced by the principles that are taught here. That there's more to the consideration than that. If it were the case that we had no qualifiers for who we help, I would think that the first duty we would have is to go around here in this community and make sure that there are no widows who are in any need at all and supply all of their needs. But there are qualifications for it, right? The qualifications are what Paul points out. And it's my opinion, and I realize what I'm doing. If you actually follow this thinking that I'm about to say, I could lose my job. But we ought to spend a lot more money on helping people, according to this idea. Maybe I said I would lose my job because you wouldn't have enough money to pay me. That's what I meant by it. There may not be that much of a need here, though, right? There may not be enough of a need to spend thousands and thousands of dollars a month. But it should be something that we consider and think about. We can look around and find other people that we can help too. And so these are decisions that we have to make. And they're decisions that should be based on principles and not just whims, not just say, I think this might be good. We have a lot of things here to consider. And I'm not suggesting that we should go out and just knock doors and give money away. I'm not saying that at all. But there are things here that are very interesting for us. So this is about balancing the burdens on the church. And the church has a lot of obligations. There are a lot of burdens that are placed on the Lord's people. And every decision that is made has to be done with careful observation to the principles that have been outlined here. I'm very thankful for what I see here in the men's meetings, because we've not always been perfect. There's no way. But from what I see, every one of us understand we're trying to work according to the principles outlined here. And these are just some of the principles we have to go by. It's good for us to remember that, though. And I'm thankful that Paul wrote that to Timothy, because it gives a lot more insight into how they did things and raises some questions too, right, that we don't exactly know what's going on. So maybe this evening you have an opportunity to make a response. If there's something that you need, we're here for you. If you need help, we're here to help you. Spiritual help, even that too, we're here to help you. If you need to be baptized for the remission of your sins, or you need prayers of the church, won't you please come as we stand and sing?